every season of American Horror Story ranked. Hey there guys, and welcome back to Dino Review. So with a new season of American Horror Story starting up in the next few weeks, I wanted to look back at every season in the series and give you guys my ranking. Now as always guys, remember this is just my own personal ranking. It is not an official ranking, so if you have yours, make sure you leave it in the comments down below and let's talk about it. But let's get into our ranking. Coming in at last place is American Horror Story Apocalypse. For me, American Horror Story Apocalypse definitely had a lot of great ideas. There was a lot of plot points in the season, but I think they just threw too much stuff at the wall. Instead, it kind of ended up being a bit of a messy season where it looked like they didn't really know what to do with the multiple storylines they had going on. Of course, this is pretty much known as the crossover season between Coven and Murder House, and I do think for the most part they get a lot of that right. But what I did like originally about Apocalypse is we had a huge new storyline, loads of new characters that actually looked quite promising. But by episode 3, a lot of them, if not most of them, get killed off, and instead we're reintroduced to the witches from Coven. I enjoy the witches and I enjoy the whole warlock storyline that they had going on, but because time travel was involved, because we were jumping from different timelines and honestly just into different character storylines, it did get quite messy very quickly. As well as that, we had Michael Langdon, the child of Satan from American Horror Story Murder House. Honestly, I thought his character was a bit of a letdown. Again, at the start of the season he looked quite promising, but as it went on and we got to know more and more about his character, he just became less and less appealing. Again, this season had a lot of promise to it. I do like the ideas they threw out there, but by the midway mark, just like a lot of American Horror Story seasons, things began to fall apart. Once we introduced time travel, even the brilliant Murder House episode pretty much went away to nothing because none of it had actually happened. So I was let down by a lot this season, but at the same time there was a lot of great ideas. I just wish they pulled them off a little bit better. Next up we have American Horror Story Cult. Now of course this is the season that came along after the election of Donald Trump, and although it's a fun season, out of every season in the series it is probably the most boring. The characters aren't hugely appealing in this storyline, and as well as that, I think when the show came out we had a bit of fatigue from Donald Trump and the entire election. Although it's a fun season, there's a lot of things that happen on it. Compared to other seasons, it's a bit dull. Even the main character of Ali, played by Paulson, she isn't a very likable character, particularly for the first half of the season. I do enjoy her story arc and how her character develops as the season goes on, but just as a character herself, she's not a character you root for or even relate to in most episodes. We also had the return of clowns this season, and just comparing it to Twisty the Clown from season 4, they didn't really live up to the hype. I do enjoy the whole cult storyline, and I think Evan Peters gave probably his best performance of American Horror Story in this season. But just the season itself, it just felt a bit off. Maybe it was a bit too grounded compared to other seasons, but I just didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would. Again, Evan Peters was definitely a strong point. I liked the entire cult storyline. Again, particularly the first half of the season. I think the second half, it just got a bit absurd and it just got a bit out of control. But overall, it's an okay season. I don't hate it, but I also don't love it. Next, we have American Horror Story Hotel, the season of gluttony. This season honestly looks absolutely gorgeous. The costume design, the set design, even the makeup, all work extremely well. As well as that, we have some great characters in this season. We have the Countess, who is by far one of the best characters in the entire series. Lady Gaga of course played her, taking over the main role that Jessica Lange had been occupying up until that point, and she does a great job. She got a Golden Globe for her performance, and it's easy to see why when you rewatch the series. As well as that, Evan Peters as Mr. March is actually my favourite Evan Peters character in the entire run of American Horror Story, and there was just a lot going on. There was a lot of different plot points, a lot of interesting characters, but again, just like Cult, there was something about it that just didn't hit. For me, I think the biggest mistake in American Horror Story Hotel was probably the Ten Commandments killer. It looked interesting when it started the season up. It looked more like a thriller than anything else, but it just kind of went away to nothing. And I think a lot of people guessed the twist way in advance. I think with other seasons of American Horror Story there are a lot of twists and turns, whereas this one it was a bit obvious a bit too soon. As well as that, recycling the whole ghost storyline from Murder House just kind of made it a bit similar to that first season, and the vaccination storyline I wasn't a fan of. The vampire storyline I actually enjoyed, I thought was great, and again Lady Gaga led that in a really good way. But as always with American Horror Story, once we got to the second half, when things started to kind of fall apart, there wasn't a lot of story left to really keep the season going. Next, at 6th place is American Horror Story 1984. For me, this is easily the most fun I've had watching a season of American Horror Story. The slasher fan in me had a great time watching this season. I love the characters, I love the location, particularly that it was set at a camp similar to Friday the 13th, and the kills were over the top, they were gory and campy in all the right ways. The first 5 episodes of course are set around the same weekend, where we follow these group of camp counselors who are getting killed one by one. Honestly, just as a slasher fan, that is exactly what I wanted out of the season. I do think though the second half of the season, when they ran out of storyline, it did get a little bit convoluted. Now I still enjoyed it for what it was. It was very over the top and campy, and once you kind of know that with the first 5 episodes, it was easy to enjoy the rest of the season. There's a lot of great characters in this one, there's a lot of great setup, but again the first 5 episodes are definitely the strongest. I think if they'd continued on and maybe even just gave us 8 episodes set around that weekend at the camp, this season would have been a lot higher on the list. Next we have American Horror Story Freak Show. Now this is a season that people either love or hate. For me, I absolutely love the characters in this one. It being set on a freak show and this kind of circus with these interesting and dynamic characters was a huge plus. Of course, this is also Jessica Lange's final season and she goes out in style. But what I personally loved about this season is the directing. They had a kind of soft focus on screen that really harkened back to older movies from the 70s, the 60s and 50s, and it did just pull you in to the world they were trying to show you. I love the characters in the season itself. As I said, Jessica Lange, although her accent is not the best in the season, she definitely carries the overall show up until that point. Kathy Bates as well, her accent is also not quite what you want from her, but both performances are incredible. Even Kathy Bates, she gets killed off halfway through that season, but she still leaves a huge impact for the rest of the episodes. The season also gave us Twisty the Clown, who is pretty iconic even though he's only in maybe the first 4 or 5 episodes of the season. And of course we get Dandy, who is an absolute crazy psychopath, and it's a character you love seeing on screen. I do think a lot of people were pretty annoyed when Twisty was killed off, but Dandy was really, for me anyway, a really good substitute. I do wish we had Twisty for the rest of the season and there could have been some interesting dynamics between him and Dandy, but overall it's a really fun season. For me, it's a very strong season and it doesn't get enough credit even to this day. I think a lot of people look back at the season as maybe the first season that struggled overall, but I think there's a lot of great things with it. I don't think that this season fell apart like most people would say with season 4. I think in the end, particularly for Freak Show compared to other seasons in the series, they wrap things up very nicely. A lot of the storylines get wrapped up by the end of the season and there is no open-ended answers. Coming in at 4th place is American Horror Story Roanoke. Now this season isn't loved by every fan of the series. A lot of people see this as one of the weaker seasons overall, but for me, I absolutely love it. It is pure horror from beginning to end and it's just much different than anything that had come before it. I do really enjoy the handheld cameras in this season, as well as that just the Blair Witch type vibes. I think this season for me was closer to Murder House and Asylum, and it was just quite refreshing after the 3 seasons that had come before it. It wasn't as campy or over the top, it wasn't as colourful, and instead they just went back to the roots of horror. I really like the whole hillbilly family we had in this one, and I love the Butcher. I think Kathy Bates did a great performance as Agnes, but also as the Butcher. She was pretty much captivating anytime she was on screen, and she is one of the most terrifying villains we've ever had in the series. Taking the number 3 spot is American Horror Story COVEN, the season of witches. This is probably the biggest American Horror Story has ever been. Just the fan reaction to this season at the time was quite huge, and it's easy to see why. We got a huge addition to the cast with the season, with Kathy Bates and Angela Bassett and Jessica Lange on top form. What I liked though about this season was just the whole storyline about the 7 wonders, about the Supreme and the witches themselves, and even just the battle between both witches groups, and then you the witches hunters in there as well. There was a lot of funny moments in this season, there was a lot of bizarre moments, but it's a great season just because it has so many twists and turns. Pretty much with this season, every single episode that ended had a huge twist that wanted you to come back next week and see how it would pay off. I honestly loved this season from beginning to end. There's not a lot of complaints I have with it at all. I think Madame LaLaurie was terrifying but also fascinating as a villain, and just seeing her turn pretty much as a racist through the entire season was at times quite hard to watch, but it is Kathy Bates, so the performance she gives is always going to be fascinating, or you're going to want to see more of it. Compared to the first 2 seasons as well, this season was just a lot different, especially after Asylum, which was so dark and gritty. This one was a lot more refreshing. It was lighter in tone for sure, but it still had the gore. It had a lot of shocking scenes and bizarre episodes. Everything you pretty much want from a season of American Horror Story. Now down to our final 2, and taking second place is the original season American Horror Story Murder House. I absolutely love watching this season. It's probably the season that I've seen most of at this time, and I love everything about it. The characters in the season are just a lot more interesting for me anyway compared to later seasons, and particularly the seasons we're getting today. There was a lot more meat to the characters, and the storylines that concern them were just a lot more interesting. I absolutely love the cheating storyline we get in season 1 between Ben and Violet. I think you're following that particularly through this family dynamic as the season goes on, which is constantly captivating because you were constantly seeing things from both characters' perspectives in their relationship while being haunted in this terrifying house. As well as that, we have Jessica Lange as Constance, who is by far my favourite character of Jessica Lange's. I think she plays the character to perfection, and she's riveting on screen because when she's on screen, she has this thing about her that draws you in. She's a horrible, wicked woman throughout the entire season, but at the same time, there is something enjoyable about watching her. We also have the whole storyline between Tate and Violet. Although I don't love that romance they have throughout the season, I do think the school shooting episode is still probably the strongest episode we've gotten of American Horror Story. It is dark and it is very hard to watch, but it leaves an impact. It gives you the emotional punch you want to get out of that season to take the subject matter extremely seriously. Although maybe the last few episodes went slightly off course, I think it is a solid season and it pretty much captivates you from beginning to end. As I said, the storylines are very strong, and also the acting. When I looked at American Horror Story 1984, although I enjoyed the entire season, I thought it was fun and bubbly, the acting was nowhere on par with that first season. Overall, Murder House set the tone for what American Horror Story was going to be. It was going to be dark and gritty, but also over the top with a lot of bloodshed and a lot of bizarre scenes. That is American Horror Story at the end of the day, and I do think the first season set the tone for that perfectly. Finally, taking first place is American Horror Story Asylum. Easily one of the darkest, if not the darkest seasons of the entire show, to a point where it did get to the midway mark and they had to throw in an over-the-top sing-along song just to lighten things up. I think this season is dark, but has some of the best characters in the entire series, particularly with Lana Winters, who's easily my favourite character overall. She's a character ripped right out of the horror movies. You follow her character as she looks to discover who Bloodyface actually is, and then finds herself in danger herself. But even the entire storyline with the Catholic Church was so strong in this season, with Sister Jude and the Nazi experiment, the aliens. We had a hell of a lot going on in this season, and for the most part it all works. I think everyone thinks this as well. The alien storyline did not hit as much as I wanted it to. I thought it was a bit bizarre and it just didn't connect as well to the rest of the season, but it's not a huge thing for me. It's a small little speck and something we can revisit in a later season. Honestly, with Asylum, I think you get a dark, gritty and bloody season. You definitely get a dark one, but it is American Horror Story. It's by far the scariest season out of the entire bunch, and it has the most fascinating characters. I absolutely love this season from beginning to end. I love everything they throw at you, even though at times it might be a bit much getting Nazis, aliens, the devil and a serial killer all in one. There's a hell of a lot going on and it does wear you down. I do think the sing-along song we get with Jessica Lange at the halfway marker just after was badly needed, because I even remember watching that season myself and I was drained from the season, just watching it every week get worse and worse for these characters. So I think having that sing-along song was a big plus, and it just gave you a boost for the rest of the season. It gave you hope for these characters that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. But guys, that is just my own ranking of every season of American Horror Story up until this point. I will do an updated list probably next year, because I did do one originally last year, but this is my updated list. As always guys, remember, if your ranking is different, that is totally fine. Leave your ranking down below and let's talk about it. Remember guys as well, if you do like this video and if you want to see more like this, click any of those links down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one.